My name is Timofey Egorov. I'm the trainer of cosmonauts and astronauts at the Gagarin Cosmonauts Training Center, Star City, Russia. Also, I'm the general director of the association Ecology of the Unknown. This is a non-governmental organization which is studying the UFOs and all the anomalous phenomena. Since 1976, our priority now is to support the signing of the Treaty on the Prevention of Placement of Weapons in Outer Space. There are different members in our organization, among them high-ranking generals, PhDs, candidates, some activists. We have connections in different countries, among them USA, Germany, Italy, Mexico. I have watched your presentations and I have discussed it with my closest colleagues, and I wanted to give you a little feedback on that.
Sure.
So, first of all, thank you for doing this. You have put in tremendous amount of time and efforts, and very nice to meet you. And I have watched the CE5 documentary, and I was very impressed. The thing we wanted to give feedback on is that we are very glad that in your speeches, when you talk about the disclosure, about the CE5 initiative, about the treaty, about the development of new sources of energy, about what needs to be done right now, you always emphasize the basis, the human basis for the new inventions, for the development of new sources of energy, for disclosing the truth, for everything this, is that we have to give each other a collaborative support.
Right, definitely. It needs to be global.
Yes. And to say more, cooperation itself, that's our take on that, is an old new psycho-emotional source of energy for all future achievements of people. What this means is that when you cooperate with someone, I'm sure you know this, you can rely on your partner, and you can feel secure, and not with weapons or fear, with cooperation, with mutual support, and when you know that you're not alone, people always sense that, and you always sense that you're not alone. And this is a motivation and inspiration that drive the progress. And I'm sure you were very inspired when you found out that we're not alone in the universe.
Yes, I've known that for a long time.
We'd like to emphasize that we're very happy to hear that we have this understanding in common, that cooperation should now prevail globally to achieve peace on Earth and peace in space. So this is our little feedback to your presentations, and thank you for doing this, and we will do our best to give this information into the right hands.
Great. Very good. I appreciate your help. We have 3 major projects we're working on. The E5 Contact Initiative. We have a few 100,000 people around the world as volunteer and sort of ambassador diplomats to these civilizations that are practicing the ability to make contact in a peaceful construct. The other is the Disclosure Project, which was actually initially called Project Starlight in the 90s when I was briefing President Clinton and his CIA director. It was actually a non-public briefing process that we were encouraging at the end of the Cold War, the cooperation between the United States and other countries to end the secrecy on this subject and to disclose it within a framework of peace on Earth and peace in space. Unfortunately, it's a very long story of how the Clinton administration got diverted and did not do that, but someday I'll tell the whole history of that.
Mm-hmm.
And subsequently, we began briefing members of Congress as well as other leaders in Canada and the United Kingdom, including their ministers of defense and former ministers of defense who had been denied access to these files. So I started a project that now has over 950 military and intelligence and corporate aerospace folks who've worked on what are properly called in the United States Unacknowledged Special Access Projects. And so a number of them have come forward publicly. Most of them have not. But of course, I have files on their material. Mm-hmm. We're bringing that out to the public as much as we can. We did a documentary that has been the most watched documentary in the world called Unacknowledged. It's had 650 million people see it. So we're trying to educate people on not only the fact that we're not alone, but why doesn't the public acknowledge this openly? how is the media corrupted, at least in the West, not to cover this? And when they do cover it, why is it always within the sort of the architecture of war? What we found is that, and this is one of the big problems that we're dealing with right now, as we began to do disclosure on these issues with credible documents and people who are on the inside, the intelligence community in the United States and elsewhere stood up a countermeasure that involved a number of people to release, as you saw a couple years ago, the UFO footage being chased down by our Navy jets off the coast of California, called Tic Tac event. And that was, in reality, a programmed leak within the Pentagon, but it was done in a way so that the mainstream news media, at least in the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada, would cover it as evidence of a national security threat.
Yes.
So what we have found is that when this subject gets covered as in the media, it almost invariably is presented as a threat to the national security or a threat from outer space. And we know, of course, that's false, but that is the underpinning of what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, to keep sort of the endless war running. And as you know, that Werner von Braun said this, the big card to play would be the alien threat card, which of course is completely a hoax. But this is what we're up against. You have people with very powerful interests in the United States and also elsewhere who are tied into the defense industry and sort of a global control of the public through fear. And I think that what we're trying to say is that that is not the way of the future. That's the way of the past that we need to bury. And it needs to go the way of the dinosaurs. And we need to start an era that's a more enlightened era that's peace, not only of this planet, but out in space. But you have the old guard, at least that I'm dealing with, extremely opposed to that. So every time we take a step forward, but these interests will circle their wagons, as we say in the States, and make sure that the leaders, the political leaders, are deceived or frightened of the subject. With the current administration, we have people who are very close friends with the president and the vice president, who in this country is head of the Space Council, is the Vice President Pence. And I have them working with me to provide an alternative perspective that presents this subject in a very hopeful way and filled with opportunities for the economy, for exploration of space, for energy, for resolving problems with the environment and pollution, et cetera, and so on. But unfortunately, they have people who are inside the national security system here and in the United Kingdom and Canada, that whenever there is some forward momentum with a president, because I've been dealing with every president since Clinton, what these folks do, the people who are inside what Mr. Trump calls the deep state, but is properly called the Unacknowledged Special Access Projects, those people will be brought in to counter and to neutralize what we're saying and doing. And this is a big problem because obviously our group is, like yours, a non-governmental organization. I'm an emergency doctor who has left my medical career to fix this problem. You might be interested. My uncle worked at Northrop Grumman. Well, it was Grumman, and worked on designing the lunar module that was landed on the moon in 1969. That was my mother's brother at Grumman, which was on Long Island, Bethpage, Long Island. However, what we find is, as I've gone around doing this now, I've been doing this for 30 years, since I was probably your age. I was a young medical doctor. It was a bit of a journey to go from emergency medicine and all the fun things like shootings and stabbings and car wrecks and end up briefing the director of the CIA. And what most people don't understand, I think, and particularly in other countries, and I can't speak to Russia, I'm not a Russian expert, but in this country, the president is the last person to know the truth about these things. The director of the CIA I briefed had made specific inquiries into the subject and had been denied access and lied to. Same thing for the Secretary of Defense in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very broken system, and you have a very clandestine black projects, which have been organized under Unacknowledged Special Access Projects, which what those means is that, of course, the Special Access Project is very, limited access, and they're top secret. But the unacknowledged ones are literally never acknowledged. If you're not inside that project, you are not told even of its existence. And so I have now, hundreds of people who have been in these unacknowledged projects. We are in the process of acquiring a top secret aerospace archive that goes back to the 50s. That is several 100,000 pages of U.S. development of EMGs, electromagnetic-gravitic devices, so-called anti-gravity. They're not anti-gravity. It's a field propulsion. We can get into that if you'd like. But the big breakthrough happened between the 30s and the 50s. Mm-hmm. And in October 1954, very specifically, is when in the United States aerospace classified projects, we mastered gravity control, quote unquote. This is from a man on my team who was head of the Naval Research Labs, which is the largest Department of Defense lab in the United States, that was inside the top secret vault that had the old dark documents about this. And so there was a researcher who is a defense contractor in the United States who's on my team and has been for many years, who has a lot of documentation of the different types of aircraft and what they look like and how they function. That look like UFOs, by the way. They look exactly like many of the ones that are from another star system, at least superficially. Now, this is very important. Superficially, to the untrained eye, which unfortunately would be 99% of military and intelligence personnel around the world, they look like a UFO. Mm-hmm. They're silent, and they move in extraordinary ways. But these are being made by the Lockheed Skunk Works, Northrop Grumman, Boeing has a division, and a number of other contractors. And those devices have been used in what is called deceptive indications and warnings. Now, a deceptive INW or a false INW is what pop culture would call false flag operations. And this whole sort of area of technology has been withheld from the public. And also, unfortunately, we have learned from the knowledge of the president and vice president for the express purpose to preserve the element of surprise. Because what they intend to do with these covert assets is to stage an alien attack, to stage something that would look like an attack coming from outer space, but which would actually be run by clandestine operations, because that would enable the world to be unified, not in peace, but in war. Mm-hmm. And this is the biggest threat to world security and peace that I know of. And, of course, that event, which they've already started doing trial balloons for, a lot of people don't realize that many of the sightings and events that have happened have been staged for their psychological warfare value. And so many of the sightings and things that look like an aggressive activity or a hostile activity by ETs, in fact, have been our clandestine operations using these advanced technologies to hoax UFO events. And this is, by the way, global. It is not just U.S. Brazil, the United States, probably in your country. The people running these projects have all access. They do not observe national treaties or boundaries or geopolitical lines. So I know the people who are in this group, a number of them. I know people who've been at the top of this group who run these clandestine operations. I've personally met with a number of them. And their long-term agenda is simply to aggregate world power around a threat that's external to the Earth, and thereby unify the people of the Earth, not in peace, but in war. So they have a very retrograde, backward, negative view of the future, and that's what we absolutely need to resolve this problem. Now, the state of the art of this is, unfortunately, in the last 2 or 3 years, since the Unacknowledged documentary came out, and we have a platform here in the United States called Netflix.
Yes, I know.
Okay. And it was the top documentary on Netflix. It's now on Amazon Prime. We moved it over to Amazon Prime because Amazon is allowing us to get this information out without it being an exclusive. It means we can also put it on a Russian site if you had Netflix in Russia or the equivalent. We could put it anywhere. So we're putting this information out so it can be seen for free by the public as much as we can, because it has the essential knowledge that people need to have who are general public. Now, policymakers in Moscow or in Washington or Beijing, there's more that they need to know. And specifically, they need to know that the counterintelligence operations, invariably, whether it's in the United States or in Israel, the United Kingdom, and perhaps your country, I can't speak to your country, they have set up false information, disinformation, that's both in the popular culture but also in official briefings. I know, for example, in our country, as soon as we got the initial briefing to the President Trump when he was the nominee for the Republican Party, a lot of people don't know this story. I haven't really talked about it publicly. But a member of his team, who is on my team, said, look, we need to get some information to the president while he's still a candidate in the event that he gets elected. So we did in September of 2016. Within about 12 hours, a counterintelligence official who had been the director of the CIA when I briefed him, R. James Woolsey, was moved in to be the national security advisor for the Trump campaign, who then negated everything we had provided and neutralized it, and then started this process of brainwashing the president and the vice president on the fact that the UFOs were a threat to the national security. So what we, I am not a government official, so what we do is we take a step forward. These people try to neutralize it. This has been going on now for 30 years that I've been involved with, since the Clinton administration. Actually, specifically, I first briefed the Clinton administration and the CIA director for Bill Clinton in December of 1993. So that was exactly 27 years ago this month. And what I've discovered in my journey doing this is that the masses of the public, many of them are willing to accept a future that's peaceful and to go into space peacefully. But people who benefit a great deal from the war machine and endless war and the arms industry, this is not good for them. It means they're going to go out of business unless they transform their business into something positive. Now, what we're suggesting is that the defense industry and the aerospace industry, there are many big opportunities here to grow their industry and business by exploring space peacefully, by preserving it for peace. Unfortunately, the people who are more sociopathic, who are very powerful people, often are sociopaths, as you know, speaking medically, clinically, those people really want to keep the world running in turmoil. They want it to be endless war. They want it to be something where they can control people through demagoguery and fear. Because ultimately, many leaders discover that they can control the masses through fear more than they can through peace and love. Therefore, they tilt towards instigating programs of fear. And this analysis is something that, of course, is not new to what we are doing, as many people have made these conclusions over the years. There are many people who feel that we probably could have avoided World War II if we had done the right things early on. There are many big wars. The Vietnam War was completely unnecessary. Much of what we have done with the Iraq War was unnecessary and based on hoaxed weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein, in fact, did not have. But there are people who benefit from these wars, and they are usually very powerful people. And the same is true, but much larger on the UFO issue. The people who benefit from the secrecy and also eventually the subject coming out as a threat would see that their fortunes and power would keep going up. If as Ronald Reagan said in front of the United Nations, if we could unite the world around a common alien threat. So this narrative is very seductive, unfortunately, to people who are backward thinking and also sociopathic, and are looking for the accumulation of vast amounts of power. I think that's where we need to have other countries, such as in Russia and China, other countries that are space powers, step into this and say, look, there's another way forward where we prevent the placement of weapons in space, where we preserve space for peaceful exploration, and moreover, where we begin to disclose the sciences and technologies that are, frankly, at least in the United States, fully developed, that would enable us to go to, say, Mars in a few minutes without using rockets. I mean, let's face it, rockets were really cool in the 40s and perhaps 50s, but to be frank with you, and my uncle, of course, knew this because he worked for Northrop Grumman his entire career, we haven't needed rockets since 1954. So the entire projects that you see going on now with the International Space Station and the rockets and SpaceX and even the 60s lunar module and rockets, the Apollo mission, those were based on technologies which were obsolete at that time. Mm-hmm. A lot of people don't know this. I call this the lost century. There's an entire century of lost technology that had gone into these unacknowledged special access projects. And the great peace dividend of ending secrecy on this would be that we would have technologies that, if they could be used peacefully, and this is the big if, would give us an entirely new civilization without pollution and without poverty. Within 20 years, there'd be no poverty on the planet. There'd be no pollution. And we could be traveling not only around the planet, but out into space with extremely advanced technologies that deal with new energy sources as well as propulsion systems. But to do that and to do it safely requires global cooperation and peace. So the global cooperation and peace part of it is what keeps getting subverted by people who want to maintain the power that they currently have. So I think it is a very big issue about geopolitical power and a sort of a vision of what the future is going to look like. Mm-hmm. And is the future going to look like, an expansion of war and dysfunction that we've had for the last 100 years on this planet, or is it going to be something totally different? And we're at the crossroads. We have to make this choice. And in my opinion, we are frankly running out of time to make the correct choices. And this is where we need to have the head of the Russian Federation, the United States, China, and others come together. And I will say, make a public statement about the fact that, number one, we're not alone. But number two, they are not hostile. And number three, that we can have many opportunities by having a relationship with these civilizations that are cooperative and peaceful. And the attempts to, for example, to have a treaty to keep the weapons out of space and preserve space for peace, that is never going to succeed without introducing the extraterrestrial factor. And the reason for that is every time it's discussed in normal geopolitical terms in the United States, the people who are very cynical just say, well, these other countries just want us to fall behind and leapfrog ahead of us by putting a pause button on our development of these kinds of weapon systems. Because what's not being put into the discussions at the United Nations and elsewhere, quite frankly, everyone's tiptoeing around the outside of the issue, is the fact that we are not alone in space, that we are not alone. We have never been alone. that there are other civilizations out there who are quite unhappy with us putting weapons in space. And that is the key missing ingredient in the discussions. Because without that, the United States defense establishment is simply going to view any sort of, it doesn't matter if there are 122 countries who have signed an agreement to prevent weapons from being placed in space. The United States and the United Kingdom is simply going to view this as a stalling tactic because it's devoid of the real reason for it. And the real reason for this agreement or treaty to prevent weapons in space would be that we're not alone in space, that there are other civilizations with whom we need to develop a peaceful rapport and a peaceful relationship. And that whole part of this, which is the big part of it, is being excluded from open conversation because it's a subject that is a forbidden subject. So we need to make sure that this subject is not forbidden, that it has to be talked about openly. And to do that, however, in a way that doesn't cause global panic, it has to be spoken of in terms of the fact that these civilizations are peaceful, that there's no evidence that they are hostile. But on top of it, they are concerned with our hostility. And this is a nuance that gets lost so often, is that humans are very narcissistic. We only think about ourselves. But if we were to step into the shoes of an extraterrestrial civilization, observing this planet and looking at how we are behaving and developing nuclear weapons and more advanced delivery systems and the capacity to end all life on Earth, at the same time, we are starting to explore space. Russia, China, United States, other countries, India. To these extraterrestrial civilizations is that we are a threat to space. So I take this and flip it around. Most people are always looking at this, there's an alien threat. I'm going, no. If they were a threat, it'd all be over. Their technologies are so advanced. They're hundreds of thousands, some millions of years more advanced than we are.
Absolutely.
It'd be absolutely over. What their concern is the unchecked aggression of humans combined with very advanced technologies and our early exploration of space. That the combination of our lack of social and spiritual development, our tendency to be violent, with very powerful weapon systems, is something that they are very concerned about, and rightly so. That these extraterrestrial civilizations, of which there are many, by the way, they're very concerned about this and very worried that humans have not evolved socially and spiritually as much as we have technologically. And that lack of balance has caused a very dangerous situation to evolve, where there are clandestine projects, at least in the United States, that have the ability to target and destroy extraterrestrial vehicles when they are in 3D. They're less effective when these civilizations' technologies are shifted into another, let's say, dimension or energy form. But as you know, I'm sure your scientists must realize this, any interstellar civilization can only do so at beyond the speed of light, but they don't actually accelerate past the speed of light. If you understand the astrophysics of that, it's not possible.
Oh, that's obvious.
Yeah, they actually have technologies where the objects and everyone on board the spacecraft shift resonantly through another dimension and go through one point in space-time to another, through another dimensional at the equivalent of thousands of times the speed of light, millions of times the speed of light, but they're using a trans-dimensional physics. And we understand this. I have people on my team down to the equations who understand the trans-dimensional physics of this. But they're concerned that our human covert programs, the ones in the United States that I have personal knowledge of, have replicated those capabilities and have also weaponized them. So the situation is worse than most people realize. I don't talk about this too much publicly. It scares the hell out of everybody. But the the development of these technologies that are in the hands of the wrong people is creating an existential threat, not only to Earth, but also to other planets. So that's sort of the state of where we are right now in a nutshell.
Well, it's all clear. I have written down some questions.
Sure.
While you were speaking. But first of all, I'd like to say that that's a great idea, what you have just said, to combine, to complement the disclosure and the treaty on the prevention of placement of weapons in outer space.
It's essential.
To combine, because that's the cooperation, that's the collaborative support. It's like, I think they complement, because imagine, I'm just thinking out loud, imagine that you're alone in the universe. It's no problem if you destroy your planet. Nobody cares.
Right.
And if you turn your mindset that we're not alone, numerous civilizations, the universe is filled with life. So, and they're observing and they're watching, but not interfering, because they cannot interfere, because that's the ethics. They will not interfere. I think they will wait for us to invite them.
They are. That's what they're waiting for. And that's actually what the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind is. It's citizens saying, we are wanting to make contact with you peacefully within the construct of universal peace, not just world peace. So that's our whole ethical universe. And I think that's the dialogue that has to begin with disclosure on this entire question of how we're going into space. Are we going in cooperatively, or as sort of a sub rosa attempt to have the military weaponize and put weapons in space? Or are we going to do this aware globally, all of us, all the children of Earth, aware that we're not alone in the universe, and therefore we can't act just selfishly, just from a selfish human perspective. We have to think of this ethically in a larger way, that we're, children of the cosmos, but there are other children of the cosmos out there. And so we can't just go out there ignorantly as if that's not a reality. Unfortunately, at a policy level, with our State Department, your foreign ministry, the United Nations, all these sort of things that are the normal political, diplomatic agreements and treaties, this whole big issue isn't being factored in properly. And until it's factored in properly, it will never progress, because one of the key things is missing. And that is that we are already being visited by and observed by advanced civilizations from other star systems. And that is something that, until that gets factored in, the dialogue it's like ships passing in the night. There's no connection that's relevant to the actual situation. And so I think this is why, whether it can happen out of the United States or Russia or China or some other country, that dialogue needs to start in a credible fashion that takes it out of the nonsense and tabloids and what have you. And that is we're running out of time, frankly, for that to happen, because in the United States, at least, the people who have been controlling secrecy on this have, in the last 2 to 3 years, greatly increased the rate of a false hoaxed disclosure of an alien threat. If you look at the news, you see the Senate, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Marco Rubio, talking about the UFOs being a national security threat. The vice president and the president, I have from very good sources who are on their team, have had people come in to present completely false evidence and false information to try to get them to accept that they need to approach the UFO issue as a threat to the national security. So unfortunately, this has already happened. Now, I think this is where actually, President Putin and leaders in other countries could be very helpful, because if they were to engage this president or the incoming president, I think there's a better chance of engaging the current president in terms of relationship between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin. If this dialogue could happen in a way so that someone at his leadership level, I mean, I'm providing advice and information, but again, I'm a medical doctor. I'm not the head of a country. I'm nobody really. And so it would be helpful to have, other world leaders coming in and saying, look, we do know that we're not alone. There's no evidence they're hostile. They are very concerned about what we are doing about attempting to put weapons in space and to target them and to develop increasingly dangerous weapons of mass destruction, new generations of nuclear weapons, all of that. And I think that dialogue coming from someone in leadership in Russia, which is, of course, a very powerful space country, as well as a very powerful nuclear country, would have a great deal of effect right now between now and January 20th. Now, after January 20th, we start all over again. You know how the United States is. It's a totally new administration. But keep in mind, presidents come and go every 4 to 8 years. This permanent bureaucracy in the United States that are these unacknowledged special access projects, they're actually the ones running the show. They're actually the ones running the country, and frankly, they're running the world. It is not, I mean, the President of the United States finds out very quickly that they do not have control over those operations. And this is a startling statement to make. It is, I can prove it. It's absolutely true. So the way the power is structured in the United States and in the United Kingdom and Canada, and the Five Eyes, what they call them, the Five Eyes countries, Australia, New Zealand, U.S., Canada, Great Britain. Those countries basically are run by clandestine, powerful organizations that have their own agenda. And I have never seen a president or a prime minister or a CIA director be able to control that group yet. Now, other countries, in combination with a president or a prime minister in the United Kingdom, actually could create a coalition to put that in check. It's like playing chess, checkmate. But that cooperation needs to happen. That international cooperation needs to happen. And frankly, the other thing that is very important, and I want to say this because it is kind of implied in what I've been saying, there has to be an announcement from legitimate world leaders on this issue and get ahead of the curve of the false disclosure. So in other words, what they're doing now through the U.S. media and around the world is, in Hollywood movies, all of it, is to present this as a hostile alien threat. And that has been put into the psychology of Western civilization for decades. What needs to happen before this clandestine group goes any further is to have them leapfrogged, to be jumped ahead by the legitimate leaders in the world who say, we're not alone, they're not hostile, they are concerned about our hostility, and we need to have a rapprochement and a dialogue with these civilizations and begin a peaceful endeavor of communication with those civilizations, with increasingly open contact and going into space peacefully. And I think that being done by a group of world leaders would very quickly put into check the thing that's unrolling very quickly. I think we're running out of time. They are pulling, if you look at the news media in the West and in Israel and everywhere, there is this constant trickle of cases that are disinformation cases that are based on there being a threat from the aliens. And I think that we're going to run out of time to where good people in the world, whether they're in Russia or China or the United States or what have you, will be able to get control over the narrative. Right now, the control of the narrative, unfortunately, is in the hands of crackpots and people who want war. Mm-hmm. So we have to create an ability that narrative begins to be elevated at a level of the United Nations and other world leaders cooperating together to disclose this subject in a way that's peaceful and hopeful, with a plan to bring forward these technologies that would completely fix, for example, global warming and pollution, and eliminate world poverty if they were disclosed. And these are technologies that do not need to be researched and developed. They are already fully developed. They are just held in classified projects. So these are all issues that need to be discussed, is what I was encouraging Bill Clinton to do, but he got scared off. He was threatened very specifically, I know for a fact. And then he was offered basically a buyout. George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush's father, was a part of the committee keeping all this secret, as was Dick Cheney. So what has happened is that there are these corrupting influences. It's all about corruption. And by the way, you can't believe the level of corruption in this area in the United States. I mean, it's unbelievable. We're not talking billions of dollars. We're talking trillions of dollars of corruption. So it's at a scale that most people in other countries can't even fathom. It's insanely large amounts of money. At least $8 to $10 trillion in the U.S. Treasury has been diverted into illegal clandestine projects, which neither the Congress nor the president have overseen. I mean that quite literally. So in order to change that dynamic, I think we have to get to a place where this whole discussion is elevated onto a global stage that's international, that would involve your country, the Vatican, the United States, Japan, all the major, say, G20 countries, as well as all the others, in a statement that we're not alone, that they're not hostile. We need to make peaceful contact. We need to move towards disclosing in a safe fashion. Could really make a difference.
Don't they realize that if they destroy this planet, they will also die too?
Well, I think perhaps, but I think the short-term game for them is control, increasing control over the planet and the population. Their long-term, or let's call it Plan B, is that if something really terrible happened, they have assets off planet as well as underground to preserve the ones that they want to preserve. I've been in a couple of these facilities, and I know they exist also out in space. So unfortunately, and that's just, I know it sounds crazy, but these people are crazy people. And they have the kind of power and technology that would allow for that. But I think that also begs another question, and that is a number of people involved in the committee who have been keeping this secret and who would like to sort of try to hoax and start an interplanetary conflict are people who are religious fanatics, who think that if they do this, then the return of Christ will happen, or the Messiah, or what have you. I've had conversations with some of these people that really sounds like something out of a Dr. Strangelove scene in a movie, but that was completely insane thinking. But they sort of feel like if we could have sort of the final Armageddon battle in space with other worlds, that would force Christ to return. This kind of insane superstition and thinking. But believe it or not, there are very powerful interests that have that worldview that are in the center of these clandestine operations in the United States.
And how do they recruit people like them? How do they choose? How do they pick out of all?
Well, they're recruited up through the system. In other words, there are people that they give them a little bit of intelligence, see what they do with it, and see if they will cooperate and maintain secrecy. They give them certain missions. Often there are inducements. I mean, a lot of people don't know this, but in 1992, I was personally offered by the head of Army Intelligence, who was on this committee, dealing with the ET and UFO issue. He personally offered me $2 billion US to end what I was doing for the public and join his group and be a member of that group. And I turned that down. And following that, There were all manner of threats, defamation of my character. I had 3 people on my team assassinated. I was almost killed. So I think people don't really understand the kinds of both threats and bribes that this group is capable of. For example, we know that the CIA director that I initially had briefed, R. James Woolsey, was given a very large amount of money to become chief counsel for Booz Allen Hamilton. And Booz Allen Hamilton is a big contractor that deals with the UFO and extraterrestrial issue, amongst other projects that they do for the National Security Agency. So the people who are hungry for money and power and are corruptible, most people in their 30s, like myself, who would be offered $2 billion bribe to end what I'm trying to achieve and join that clandestine operation, would take it. And this was literally a serious offer. But I think that I was an outsider that they wanted to neutralize. Now, if you're coming up through the system, the way that works is they will give you a little bit of information and exposure, and they will see what you do with it. And if you can obey the rules of secrecy and stay on the agenda. Unfortunately, for people who are brought in at that level, if they're high enough and they defect, then those people are simply assassinated. There was a former head of the CIA, Bill Colby, who was in the process of providing one of these energy generation devices to us and some funding so we could get it out. And the week he was going to meet with a member of my board, they found him floating down the Potomac River. It made it look like a boating accident. So I know this sounds like a novel or a movie, but it's my life, and it's all 100% what I'm telling you is true. So I think that they recruit people in the manner I described, but then they retain them through both very great compensation and access to power and knowledge and information, which is extremely interesting. I know of 2 people who were brought into this clandestine operation who were already very wealthy. One was a billionaire. But what he wanted, he didn't care about the money. He wanted to learn about these classified technologies and understand how they worked and get on the inside of the technology play. And so he sold his soul to the devil, as we say in America, so that he would have access to the technologies. He didn't care about money because he was already a billionaire. So, this is the way the big power game is played. I've been involved with that for too long and know the details and the wherefores and the who's and how it's done. The main thing is that the group that is running these projects are essentially, if you were to, you know what the mafia is, the largest criminal organization in the world controls the UFO issue clandestinely. I mean, just think of it that way. I mean, think of the worst and most vicious drug cartel times 1,000 or 1,000,000, and that's what you're dealing with. It is 100% true, and this is why it's been so difficult. Most people who are the president or a senator in this country, they run up against that kind of power, and they run the other way. They absolutely submit to it. So this is why I'm quite concerned that unless there's some international backup and assistance, not only for the messaging on this, that the fact that these UFOs and ETs are not hostile, but also that that there would be support for an international collaborative effort in space for peace and to develop these technologies in a way that they could be used to help all of humanity, etc. If that doesn't happen, on a global basis, it's going to be very hard for any U.S. president, even though most people view that person as one of the most powerful people in the world. In a way, it's sort of what Truman said, and then Bill Clinton, after he ran into all this secrecy, Bill Clinton repeated the quote from President Truman where he said, "The White House is the crown jewel of the federal penitentiary system." you're basically in a very fancy prison at the White House, and that there's a great deal of truth to that. So I'm afraid that this is something that absolutely needs international cooperation, collaboration, and some wisdom and courage from quarters outside of Washington to support what we're trying to do with the outgoing president and with the incoming president, both of whom we have access to, but exactly how they will decide to behave. I'm a little bit worried that they're both both President Trump and his vice president have been surrounded by disinformation agents that they trust, that have provided them with incorrect information. And in the case of the incoming president elect, Joe Biden, we know that for years he had been surrounded by people providing him with wrong advice and information on this subject. So we're it's not a clean slate. We're starting actually in a hole, and we need people who would understand this quite well, who are allies of the United States, but also in some sense, even if they're adversaries, but there's cooperation in certain arenas with the United States and Russia or China, that those people step to the forward and say, look, we need to go beyond our differences here, and we need to do something really amazing and something that is once in a millennium sort of development for the human species and for Earth, and engage at that very high level of discussion with the leadership in the United States. I will tell you that even in the Congress, I have people working with the senior leaders of the United States Senate and House of Representatives who have told me that the same elements that have gone to the president and vice president and convinced them that the aliens are a threat, etc., have been up on Capitol Hill doing the same thing and sort of brainwashing our congressional leaders. So this is in my 30 years of doing this, to be honest with you, I have never seen it this bad, where there is a huge push to convince leaders in the United States and other Western allied countries of the threat, while the mainstream media begins to slowly release evidence, but with a narrative attached. What they're doing, they'll release some evidence, but you'll notice in every news story is presented as a threat. They'll work in this scary aspect to it. And that's because in the United States, the media is completely controlled by the CIA, 100%, on anything like this.
Dr. Greer, how do you think, shall this change come from the top or from the bottom or from both sides?
It has to happen simultaneously, both. The reason I've continued to work at a level where I provide information to leaders as we have access to them in the United States and elsewhere, but my main focus has been to educate the populace and also to inspire the average person to view themselves as citizen ambassadors to civilizations. And that's why, I started the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative back in 1990. This is the 30-year anniversary of that. And because I feel that ultimately the masses and the grassroots need to understand this subject. Now, the difficulty with that is because the mainstream media in the United States, and many other Western countries, are heavily influenced by the intelligence community, and they will blacklist a voice like mine from saying what I've just said in this discussion with you, and be sure that the people who are put out to the public are people who are putting out disinformation that it's a threat. So I think this is why, we've pivoted to doing these documentary films and getting them out on Amazon Prime and Netflix and doing things on the internet. But, at some point, those doors may shut for us. We see that there is a consolidation of totalitarian power even in Silicon Valley, where narratives and information that these tech giants don't want out, they will ban it off of their site. And so, I think unfortunately the windows are closing, and we need some help. Really, I mean, what we're trying to achieve, we need the help of people and institutions and media from other countries, yours as well as others.
Yes, we have a similar situation in Russia. We have a tremendous corruption as well, but the UFO subject is not so discussed as it is in the USA, to my knowledge. And regarding that, what you have said, that the change can come from both sides, from the top and from the bottom, we also try to educate people through the internet, and also right now we are about to start an international social movement which will be called the Ethics of the Cosmos. It will deal with many issues on what we have just discussed today, the treaty as well, the disclosure, the education of the public, the assistance in adoption of state decisions and education of world leaders. But it will start as a social movement, because we have put a lot of effort, and we're continuing to do that, and we have some successful achievements in that field to reach the leaders, to reach decision makers, and we have some connections in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. But we now realize, as you also, that we have a little amount of time, and we have to burn the candle from both sides, from multiple sides.
Yes,
if it has multiple sides. So we are continuing our efforts to reach the leaders and decision makers, and we are now starting this international social movement, which later we want to be introduced in the UN, to join the UN agreement. Or do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yes, yeah, I do. Yes.
Okay.
We can collaborate on that, and
yes.
If there's ways that we can collaborate and I can help
yes.
provide information or material, trying to get it out to the widest possible number of people, because I do think it has to happen on both levels. One reason is that as one of my physicists that I know said, the fools may blow it yet, and get us in a big trouble, but the masses of the people, if they are properly educated, can correct whatever mistakes are made, even if it's somewhat of a disaster. So I think ultimately the public needs to be informed and educated. It would be great if leaders around the world would begin to act in a responsible manner on this issue, because I think if they don't, I think one of my warnings is if they stay passive or silent, as they have been on this issue for so many decades, these clandestine operations are moving quickly to create a crisis, and to falsely present the presence of these other civilizations as a threat to the world. And given the fact that the technologies exist to hoax a false flag operation that would be extremely convincing, I know at my meetings with the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency in the United States, as well as the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff and many other people, they were not read into or briefed on the technologies that these covert programs have. And therefore, as military commanders, they would have been completely caught off guard and surprised by the use of those technologies, even though they were under classified human control. They would have all believed it was extraterrestrial when it wasn't. So this entire is completely a complex issue. I mean, in terms of, we make these assumptions that someone who is very high up in the Pentagon or in the CIA, or perhaps even in your military, would know all of this. But what I have found is that they often do not. And they're often have been lied to about it or deceived, because the element of surprise is what they're trying to preserve. They want to preserve the element of surprise to hoax an attack or an event that looks like a threat from outer space when it isn't, because that's how they can consolidate world power. And I think, and also create panic. I mean, look what they've done with the coronavirus. They've taken a virus that is very deadly, but only to a certain demographic. I'm speaking now as a medical doctor. Mm-hmm. And they've caused such panic and shutdown of the global economy that the UN is now saying 250 million people are going to die because of the economic collapse and starvation and everything else. So we're going to have 100 times more people die from our response to the virus than from the virus itself. Well, this is insane. I'm talking now as a medical doctor.
Oh, yes, I see.
This is just completely stupid. But now, of course, Sweden isn't doing that, but most countries are. And so now, so if you look at how people have been brainwashed and stampeded into fear on this, multiply that times 1,000 as they begin to falsely hoax a threat from outer space. And the public will be so frightened that they will be able to control the populace to do all manner of things in a totalitarian, dictatorial regime. So I think that we have to understand that this is all about the consolidation and growth of geopolitical power under a fascist covert interest group. And we have to be very blunt about the fact that that's what's actually going on. Now, of course, they always present themselves as people protecting the homeland or the motherland, or they'll always present themselves as sort of, we're here to protect you from these horrible aliens or whatever. I grew up in the United States where, we were being protected from the horrible Russians. It's all nonsense. It's all a big game being played to brainwash people, to keep people hating each other, instead of becoming a peaceful world civilization that goes forward peacefully into space. And I think we have to, begin to let the public know that this is how they're being deceived. But I think we need to find leaders around the world that understand this and can break out of the pack, as it were. I mean, there's a lot of peer pressure, by the way, amongst world leaders. When I approached various leaders in Japan and other countries with the suggestion that they need to take the lead on this, they just go, no, this is too big of an issue, and we don't want to get ahead of the United States on it, et cetera, and so on. So I've had conversations with cabinet level people in the United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, other places, and that is kind of how they react to it. And I go, well, someone needs to take the lead. But usually, unless it's coming out of Russia or United States or China, most other countries don't want to get in the way of these big superpower interests. And this is why a lot of the smaller countries tend to look for leadership from these more powerful countries. But that leadership hasn't been forthcoming, and it needs to be. So, yes, we need to do grassroots education and what have you, but to be honest with you, there absolutely needs to be a very vigorous briefing process and a plan of action made at the level of various world leaders, both the United States and Russia and other countries, and at the United Nations. And that needs to happen pretty quickly, because from what my sources inside the CIA have made it quite clear that they're looking at a fake hoax disclosure of this subject sooner rather than later that would push the whole world into panic, and with there being a threat from the aliens. And we know that this is false, but I think, we don't have 30 years here. We may have a few months or a year or two. So it needs to, these changes need to happen pretty rapidly.
And are they counting on that when they hoax such an event, they would assume the public to panic, to suddenly obey those who will be telling them what to do under their fear?
Yes, of course. And the beta testing of that has been the coronavirus response. And, You have people doing things that are completely anti-scientific and make no sense.
Yes.
And yet they're being very obedient. So my view of it is that the coronavirus, whatever its origins, has been used by some of these same interests as an experiment, social experiment, to see if the public would respond and be submissive and obedient to whatever edicts are given. I think that is preparatory to what's coming. This is my intelligence on this. So the whole coronavirus pandemic is sort of a dress rehearsal, let's say, for this larger sort of world-encircling threat from outer space that they want to present. But they, again, if you look at what's been going out in the media in the last 2 or 3 years, they clearly have stepped up the pace of releasing information, but associating with that, say, a case like the Tic Tac case off the coast of California, where Navy jets chased those objects, associating it with a narrative of being a threat to national security in the United States. Now, eventually, they'll present this as a threat to world security, and they will hope that the leaders of the world go along with it because they will be in a state of panic. The assets that can be deployed, and by the way, there's a man on my team that I met with a number of years ago who had been on an interagency committee in 1974 where he said we could have hit a button and we would have had these man-made UFOs deployed doing all kinds of terrifying things. And he said the entire world would have been convinced we're under alien attack. And that, he said, that system was fully operational in 1974, and he said it was not new, that it had been around for some time before that. So this is something that could be done at any moment, and it's obvious that they are psychologically already providing the disinformation through the mainstream media and through the release of certain cases to the public that is setting that stage. So, strategically, what I see is a quickening of the pace of them getting ready to pull the trigger on this hoaxing of a false alien threat, as Werner von Braun spoke of back to Carl Rosin many years ago in the 70s. I'm sure he knew of that plan, and whether or not he knew of the details, the operational details that I have since learned, I can't speak to that. But I personally have been briefed on the operational details of it, and in extensive details. So, and that's why we're in the process of organizing this aerospace archive that documents all the different types of man-made UFOs that have existed since the 50s that could be used in a false flag operation.
What exactly are they waiting for? They want the public to reach a certain degree of panic or brainwash state? So
yes, it's been a long-term project which they are increasing the pace of through the media, through the idiotic UFO community, through the Hollywood movies like Independence Day and the Alien movies, to sort of condition people to assume that life in outer space, not human, is terrifying, violent, invading, etc. So this has now been moved up to where the mainstream media and politicians are talking about it, not just the tabloids and Hollywood movies. So it's part of a long-term, multi-decade acculturation and psychological conditioning project. But what I'm seeing is that is picking up pace to where the indications are that they're going to pull the trigger on this sooner rather than later. And it's not going to be good if the leaders of your country and my country and other countries around the world aren't aware of the hoax. If they're aware of the possibility of it being a hoax, they can sort of realize that's what it is. If they actually are fooled and think that it's ET, then we're all going to be in a world of trouble. So knowledge is power, my friend. And if knowledge like this needs to be in the hands of the people who would respond to an event, I call this like a cosmic 9/11, that they would like to do. And I think they're already doing the mainstream politician and media conditioning of it. That's what's happened in the last 2 to 3 years. But I see that is only, the pace of that is increasing. And I know from my sources inside the White House and inside Capitol Hill that there are counterintelligence agents who have been going up there, brainwashing them in private briefings, presenting all kinds of terrifying and false information. So I know that the pace of this has exponentially increased in the last year or so.
Can you please tell me more about these new sources of energy that have been developed already?
Yes, well, of course, I mean, there were scientists that began to experiment with this that are, very human back in the era of Faraday and Maxwell, and in the late 1800s, and Nikola Tesla called it the infinite energy field, and had basically what they are very high voltage electromagnetic systems that open a vector into what's called the 0 point or quantum vacuum field of energy. Other scientists, such as Professor Dirac, D-I-R-A-C, called it the Dirac-C of baseline energy that's in space all around us. And it's been estimated that, the volume of space that would fit in your coffee cup would have enough energy to boil off all the oceans of the world, that the potential energy that's in the space around us. Now, what began to be developed in the 20s, 30s, 40s with some experiments that were done to pull energy out of that 0 point or quantum vacuum, they're really slightly different, but we won't get into the physics of it here, field. Those began to be really greatly improved once we had better instrumentation and, of course, integrated circuits and things of this sort, and abilities to measure voltage and control the signal. Because what's key is very high voltage at a certain resonance, hertz, cycles per second. So these things began to become out that each time one would get discovered by a civilian, they would be confiscated because this coming out would terminate oil and gas immediately as a need of energy. This was then experimented with in a sort of modified way with systems with crystalline materials by T. Townsend Brown back in 1928-29, that period, as well as the Koloski-Frost experiment in Germany, where they were able to create a very high voltage systems at certain resonant frequencies that would cause objects to levitate. So now you're getting into this effect of sort of field propulsion as well as mass cancellation, where it gets into all kinds of issues around the spin, the angular momentum of subatomic particles, etc. But where something actually begins to levitate, even though it's quite heavy. So those experiments began actually in the 20s, and we're going forward in 30s and 40s. Now, all of that was greatly potentiated after we were able to down extraterrestrial vehicles beginning in the, well, we don't know, perhaps 20s. I have a photograph of an ET being dissected on a table from 1920s that I've just acquired from an archive of a woman who worked on the atomic bomb project, who's deceased, but whose family found this photo. That photo is quite fascinating. But the point I'm making is that the research that happened on extraterrestrial vehicles and technology was combined back in the 40s and 50s with this innate human research that had been going on since the late 1800s. And there was a huge breakthrough that occurred between the end of World War II and 1955. So that's why I say, in October 1954 is when all those experiments were culminated in the ability to very properly control gravity around an object or mass effect. And that's when they began to be able to develop and deploy man-made UFOs that were completely silent and so-called anti-gravity with field propulsion systems. So, our archive on this is very, very extensive. Let's unpack that a little bit. The energy technologies that would simply allow you to run your house or car without any pollution and at zero cost economically, because you're pulling energy from the space around you, you would not have a power bill. Number one, would eliminate poverty around the world. Number two, would be a whole new area of energy and industry and research and development that would be larger than Apple and Netflix and Amazon combined, but also would correct the environment and in pollution, sources of pollution. Now, the downside of it is oil-producing states like Russia or Saudi Arabia would have to very quickly stand up the ability to have these new technologies as the center of their economy rather than the old fossil fuel economy of the 1800s and early 1900s. But so that's an economic transition that would need to be planned and done pretty carefully. The other part of it is the propulsion systems. Now, those systems, because anybody could figure this out, you don't have to be a military strategist to realize that if you have the ability to go from Tehran to Washington in 2 or 3 minutes, that amounts to a very advanced non-rocket type of missile delivery system, which, if we don't have a peaceful world, could have very frightening military applications. Now, the truth of the matter is classified projects have already done that. So whatever you see in the news or in a normal Jane's Defense weekly briefing is decades old. I will just tell you that for a fact. So those technologies, while they would be wonderful for space exploration and for travel around the world, would, if they're not used for strictly humanitarian peaceful purposes, would be quite the Pandora's box. And that's why there has to be global international cooperation for peace on this planet as well as in space, because there is no way that we can go forward as a civilization with the sort of 1800s paradigm of energy and technology we have. However, to go forward, we're going to have to bring forward these technologies that, if they are used in war, would be rather devastating. So this gets back to this whole question of social and spiritual development that has to happen in a parallel way at the same time, concomitantly with technological development. And we need to be able to do both at the same time. We're running out of time to do it sequentially. So now we have to get a leadership around the world where it's done in a coordinated fashion.
I agree. This is a very important question if these technologies are in the wrong hands, because you have to have a high level of your ethics, of your morality, to manage such great powers, such great capacities. And of course, yes. And of course, I'm absolutely positive that the ETs are observing this. This is a very important moment in the history of humanity, and they are looking if we, the humans, will be able to, at last, cooperate between each other. And then, if we do, they will welcome us to the vast galaxy family, and no problem. If we can get along with each other, why not? And if we will not be able, then it will be a sad story.
Well, that is. I mean, this could be, if this isn't handled properly, it could be the extinction of our civilization as we know it. I think that the ETs are very aware of this. I have had personal contact with ETs, and I know what their concerns are. And I think that, after 70 years after World War II of things going quite sideways, the only way it's going to get resolved is not only the public being educated properly, but the world leaders coming together, vowing to live together peacefully, but also to go into space peacefully, and to have these technologies applied peacefully. And for that to happen, there would have to be a international agreement that any weaponization of these new technologies would be strictly forbidden, and anybody who did the entire world would frankly rise up to neutralize that threat. There has to be international cooperation, because unfortunately there will always be demagogues and sociopaths who get the reins of power in one country or another who would not be responsible. So you have to be able to, at this early stage of a global peaceful civilization on Earth, it's been likened to the peace of the chained dogs. Some of these rabid dogs would have to be put on chains, but because otherwise they will simply get out of control, and they will use these technologies for very destructive purposes. So it's a bit of a catch-22 in the sense that we have to create the ability to have a peaceful civilization, which requires these new technologies, because we're destroying the biosphere. On the other hand, if the technologies come out and there's no system in place to ensure that they're used exclusively for peaceful purposes, then we could be in even more trouble. So, we're caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, as they say in the States here. But, we've lost 70 years after World War II, where a lot of this should have been dealt with because of the secrecy. And this is the key thing about disclosure, because of the extreme secrecy that Eisenhower warned about on this issue. We now have lost 60 or 70 years that we need to make up for very quickly. And that's why the matter is of some great pressing urgency, as I've been presenting this to the White House folks. But there need to be a lot of other people educated on this subject at the international level, other countries, the United Nations, what have you. What I have found is that most people, when they start to look into this, who are at a very high level, like I've dealt with a couple UN Secretary Generals, they have someone that comes into their office and threatens them. So we're going to have to do this in a way where there are enough people who work together all at once to sort of vitiate the threat or neutralize the threat.
Yes, because if you're alone and you get some sensitive information and then someone comes to you and threatens you, I can imagine that you'll be afraid for your life, for the life of your family.
Well, that's true for most people. In my case, I just tell them fuck off, but excuse my language. People who know me well, look, I deal with gangbangers with guns in my face, and I'm not someone who scares easily. But yes, I think most people who are politicians, lawyers, bureaucrats, these are not the frontline battle people, right? So, and I'm not trying to disparage them. I'm just saying they don't have it. A cosmonaut or someone going into space on top of a glorified Roman candle, which we call a rocket. I mean, there takes some courage there. But a lot of people who are in these government bureaucracies are not famous for having courage. I think we need to explain why that courage needs to be manifested. And I have said for some time that the reason the world is in the state it's in is a lack of courageous people to do the right thing. Even if it's dangerous, even if there's social opprobrium and ridicule, even if, I gave up my medical career to do this. But I think for most people, they have their own selfish interest at the forefront. And I think we have to find people who have a larger vision of a concern for humanity and the planet and our future. And I have 10 grandchildren now. What kind of world? What kind of world are we leaving to these kids and grandkids? Or to your generation? So I think it's very important that we find people who can comprehend these issues, but also have the moral fiber and courage. Yes. There are a lot of people who mean well, but when the going gets tough, they just run away. And I think we have to find people who have both the moral vision as well as the courage to come together to make this change happen. And that's really, to me, the information we have, we can present the data, the documents, the technologies, the files. But ultimately, the leadership on this is going to require some serious moral courage and integrity. And that's what we need. We're in short supply of, and we need to find.
And to finish my previous thought, if there are numerous people who know about this subject, they can say, if someone threatens them, they can say they're not alone. There are a lot of people who know this, and you cannot threaten me because that's the truth, and like you told them. But maybe you have more courage.
That's correct.
Maybe you have more courage than an average person, but still, now you can see, I hope you can see that you're not alone. You know that you're not alone, but you can be sure that in Russia we also have some stories to tell and some...
Oh, I'm sure, yes.
Let's go hand in hand.
Yeah, I agree, 100%. Well, look, I have a meeting I need to get to. I hope we can discuss this more in the future. Maybe sometime if we could set it up, I could come to Russia and we could have some meetings there. And I could bring some more information and files that I think your team and others in Russia might find very interesting.
Okay.
And I hope if you can come to the States, we can meet. I have a home in Washington, so if you're ever in Washington, let me know.
Okay, thank you. You have to go. It was a pleasure to talk with you, and of course, I will relay this information to all my colleagues, and we'll try to get this information to the right people, so we can cooperate from now. And what I have discovered from this conversation is that we can combine the disclosure, the ET issue, and the Treaty on the Prevention of Placement of Weapons in outer space, because what I think is that, as I have already said, that first of all, the ETs are observing us, and they watching if we can get along with each other. And the second thing is that there will be a law, a world-binding law. We can put those dogs on chain. If some who has not a very high level of morality or ethics would try to apply these technologies in war, then the whole world community will stop them from doing this, because there will be a law. So this is very important, I think.
We can create peace, but it has to be enforceable peace, and we can have an agreement to keep the weapons from space, but it has to be linked to the fact, if it just falls into the domain of geopolitical big power competition, the United States will never agree to that. It has to be put into the construct of that we're not alone in the universe, and that these other civilizations don't want to see us to put weapons in space.
I agree.
And so I think that combining that, and that has to be combined with a very hopeful and peaceful announcement that we're not alone, that the evidence is there, and that now we need to start a new chapter in human history where we open peaceful dialogue with these civilizations and go into space peacefully, and that we begin to carefully release these technologies for humanitarian reasons, and for the use of peaceful energy and propulsion. And I think that vision, I think any leaders in the world that come together and decide to do that, they would need to do it in a cooperative way, but also, quite frankly, move fairly quickly, because these clandestine operations know everything that everyone is doing, and if they dither too long, if it becomes too much of a bureaucratic process, it takes too long, there'll be a tidal wave wash over them and neutralize their effort. Time is of the essence, is what I'm saying. And I know that when President Kennedy was faced with this group and was trying to put through the federal review system a plan to basically dissolve the CIA and get this group under control, that's when it took too long. He was too quiet about it, and he was not transparent with the public in the media, and in the intervening period, he was assassinated. So I think that it's very important that people understand they need to have some very good advice on how to do this with alacrity, efficiently, quickly, smartly, because the adversary on the other side is going to know everything that's happening in real time, 100%. I don't care how encrypted your system is, they're going to know what's going on. So I think it's very important for people to understand that it has to be done smartly. And the more it bogs down into endless discussions and bureaucratic delays, all that is doing is playing to the strengths of the folks who want war.
Yes, and that's why it's a good principle to burn the candle from multiple sides. Do everything we can in the directions we need to go.
I'm going to need to jump off here and get to a meeting, but
okay.
I want to thank you for your time, and I hope we can meet soon.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.